Success is only celebrated until you actually achieve it. Then suddenly you're the villain. But tonight, one young man changed that narrative forever. The auditorium was packed. Rows of chairs filled with eager spectators, the soft hum of whispered conversations mixing with the occasional shuffle of footsteps. The air buzzed with anticipation, not for the panel itself, but for the inevitable clash that was about to unfold. At the center of it all sat Rebecca Lawson, a name that carried weight in the corporate world. CEO of Orion Tech Solutions, a company that had grown from a struggling startup to an industry powerhouse under her leadership. She wasn't just respected, she was a force to be reckoned with. Sharp mind, unshakable presence, single mother. Her son, Daniel, sat in the front row watching. 18 years old. First year at Stanford. Smart, observant, but never the type to seek the spotlight. He was here to support his mother, not to be part of whatever was about to happen. And then there was Ethan Reynolds, a journalist known for his unapologetic, take-no-prisoners style. He had built his reputation by grilling politicians, CEOs, and public figures, exposing what he called corporate hypocrisy. Rebecca knew the moment she saw his name on the panel's guest list that today wouldn't be about work-life balance or leadership challenges. No, this was an ambush in the making. She took a slow breath, keeping her expression neutral as the moderator introduced the panel. Tonight we're discussing the challenges of balancing career and family, and the expectations placed on women in leadership roles. Our panelists include... Rebecca barely listened. She already knew how these things went. A few softball questions to warm things up, followed by a sudden shift in tone when the real attack began. And sure enough, it came faster than expected. Ethan leaned forward, his voice calm, but edged with something sharper. Rebecca, your company reported record profits last quarter while laying off nearly 200 employees. Many of them were single parents. How do you justify that? The audience stirred. Some nodded, others glanced at Rebecca, waiting. She didn't flinch. It's never easy to make those decisions, Ethan. But let's be clear. Running a company isn't about emotions, it's about sustainability. We provided severance, outplacement services, and in some cases, rehiring opportunities. If we hadn't made those cuts, the entire company would have been at risk. Ethan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That's an interesting way to say profit over people. A few chuckles from the audience. The trap was set. Rebecca could feel Daniel watching her. She knew he wanted to say something, but he wouldn't. Not yet. But the real fight hadn't even started. Ethan wasn't backing down. He had come prepared, and the smugness in his expression made it clear. He thought he had Rebecca cornered. Rebecca adjusted the mic in front of her, keeping her voice even, measured. Ethan, if you're suggesting that layoffs are easy decisions, then you don't understand leadership. I didn't enjoy making that call, but keeping the company afloat means ensuring the majority of employees still have jobs. Ethan leaned in, feigning curiosity. So, what you're saying is, you have no regrets? That's your official stance? Rebecca met his gaze without blinking. My official stance is that I did what I had to do, just like any leader would. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some nodded in agreement, others exchanged glances. But Ethan wasn't finished. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, theatrics in full force. I spoke to one of your former employees, a single mother, worked for your company for over a decade. She said, and I quote, Rebecca Lawson sits in her penthouse office making decisions that destroy lives. She talks about being a mother, but she doesn't understand what real working-class parents go through. The audience shifted. This was personal now. Rebecca felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her, waiting for a reaction. She could already picture the headlines. Out-of-touch CEO defends layoffs while living in luxury wealthy businesswoman claims to understand struggling parents. She took a breath. Do not let him dictate the narrative. I'm a single mother, Ethan. I know exactly what it's like to struggle. I know what it's like to miss soccer games because I was working late. I know what it's like to hold my son while wondering if I was making the right choices. She turned to the crowd. And I also know that if I failed, if I made the wrong business decision, thousands of employees wouldn't have paychecks to put food on their tables. That's the reality of leadership. It's not about making everyone happy. It's about making sure we survive. Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. That's a nice rehearsed speech. But let's be real. When was the last time you had to choose between rent and groceries? A few people laughed, and Rebecca felt her jaw tighten. Daniel sat up straighter in his chair, his hands clenched into fists. Ethan saw an opening and pushed harder. See, Rebecca, I think the issue here is that you like to talk about struggle, but you don't actually live it. You tell working mothers to work harder, but you've never had to work 2 jobs just to survive. You've never had to beg for overtime just to cover medical bills. You sit in a $1 million office making decisions that hurt people. Rebecca's voice was calm, but her patience was cracking at the edges. Ethan, let me ask you something. Have you ever built something from the ground up? Have you ever put in 16-hour days, risked everything, and faced the possibility of failure every single day? Ethan smirked, but he hesitated. Just for a second. Rebecca pressed on. Because I have. And let me tell you something. Being at the top doesn't mean you stop struggling. The struggles just change. You think success means I don't worry? That I don't have sleepless nights wondering if I'm making the right calls? If you believe that, then you don't understand the first thing about leadership. Ethan opened his mouth, ready to fire back, but before he could, a new voice cut through the tension. That's enough. Daniel stood up. The entire room went silent, but no one expected what was about to happen next. The moment Daniel stood up, every eye in the room snapped to him. A kid, 18 years old, standing up in front of an entire audience, in front of a well-known journalist, in front of his mother. Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. And you are? Daniel took a step forward, voice calm, steady. I'm Daniel Lawson, Rebecca's son. The room shifted. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air. Ethan leaned back in his chair, smirking like he had already won. All right, Daniel, go ahead. Defend your mom. Tell us how hard her life has been while she's sitting at the top. Some people in the crowd chuckled. The tension in the air felt sharp, like everyone was waiting for Daniel to make a mistake, to fumble, to prove that Ethan was right. But Daniel didn't blink. He took another step forward, making sure his voice carried through the room. You think my mom doesn't understand struggle? Let me tell you something. When I was 5, she worked 2 jobs while building her company from nothing. She'd come home late, exhausted, barely enough energy to eat dinner, but she always sat with me, always made sure I felt safe. Ethan opened his mouth, but Daniel didn't give him a chance. When I was 7, my mom had to make a choice, put every penny she had into keeping the company alive or play it safe and go work for someone else. She chose to fight for what she built. And you know what that meant? That meant selling our car. That meant late bills. That meant missing Christmas presents one year. You want to talk about struggling parents? I watched my mother break herself in half to build something not just for her, but for me. The audience was silent now. Daniel locked eyes with Ethan. You're acting like success erases struggle. Like the moment someone makes it, their past disappears. But that's not how it works. My mother didn't just wake up one day as a CEO. She became one after fighting for it, after earning it. And now, because she's successful, you want to act like she doesn't understand what it's like to struggle. That's garbage. Ethan shifted in his seat, but Daniel wasn't finished. You think layoffs are an easy choice? You think she enjoys sitting in her office making decisions that affect real people? She loses sleep over it. She hates that it has to be done. But you know what happens if she doesn't make those choices? The whole company goes under. then it's not 200 people without jobs, it's thousands. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some were nodding. Some were rethinking their stance. Ethan's smirk faltered for the first time. Daniel leaned in slightly, voice lower but still carrying through the room. You want to know the difference between you and my mom? You sit here pointing fingers, acting like you care about working people. But what have you built? What have you risked? My mom built something that gives people jobs. She doesn't just talk. She does. The audience stirred. Ethan opened his mouth, but it was clear. The power in the room had shifted. And Daniel? Daniel had just won the room. Ethan tried to recover, but the shift in the room was undeniable. He adjusted his mic, clearing his throat. That's a touching story, Daniel. But let's be honest, your experience is hardly representative of the average American family. Most single parents don't get the luxury of building multi-million-dollar companies. Daniel didn't hesitate. You're right, most don't. But not because they're not capable. It's because they don't get the chance. Ethan's eyebrows lifted slightly. Daniel continued, confident, clear. You're sitting here acting like success is a crime. Like the second someone makes it, they become the enemy. But let me ask you something, Ethan. Where do you think jobs come from? Where do you think paychecks come from? You think companies just appear out of thin air? The audience was hooked now. Daniel turned slightly, addressing the crowd. You know what's funny? If my mom had failed, if she had given up when things got hard, nobody would be sitting here calling her privileged. Nobody would be calling her out of touch. You only get labeled that when you win. A few scattered claps. Daniel's voice stayed steady. She started with nothing. She sacrificed for years. And now that she's successful, you want to act like she's the villain? What kind of logic is that? Ethan leaned forward, trying to regain ground. No one is saying success is a crime, Daniel. But don't you think it's fair to ask if someone in her position still understands the struggles of the people working under her? Daniel tilted his head slightly, like he was genuinely considering it. Then he spoke. Understanding struggle doesn't mean living it forever. My mum remembers what it's like to be broke. She remembers what it's like to cry in her car because she didn't know if she could pay rent that month. She remembers not having health insurance, worrying that one medical bill would ruin everything. He paused. Let that sink in. Then he said the words that would set the internet on fire. Success doesn't erase struggle. It proves you survived it. The room was dead silent for a second. Then, like a spark catching flame, a wave of applause swept through the audience. Ethan forced a laugh, but he wasn't smiling anymore. That's a catchy line, Daniel. But let's get real. Your mom still had advantages other people don't. She had access to education, connections. Daniel cut in smoothly. Connections. My mom didn't come from money. She didn't have family to pull strings for her. She made her own connections by working her way up. You say that like success is handed out like a raffle ticket. It's earned. Ethan tried again. You're missing the point. The issue isn't just about success. It's about fairness. Shouldn't the system be designed so that more people have opportunities like your mother had? Daniel nodded slowly, then delivered the final blow. I agree. More people should have opportunities. So why aren't we encouraging them to build, to take risks, to try? Instead, people like you sit on panels like this, tearing down the ones who do. You don't want fairness, you want a villain. The audience erupted. Applause, cheers, agreement. Ethan looked like he was trying to figure out how this had happened. Rebecca? She just sat there, watching her son, prouder than she had ever been. Ethan forced a chuckle, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. He had lost control of the conversation, and he knew it. The moderator, sensing the shift in the room, cleared his throat. All right, let's keep things civil here. But the audience wasn't interested in civility anymore. Someone in the back shouted, "Let him talk!" Another voice followed. "The kid's got a point." Ethan shifted in his chair, clearly irritated now. "Listen, I'm not saying your mother hasn't worked hard, Daniel. But the reality is, people like her." Daniel tilted his head. "People like her?" Ethan hesitated, just for a second. Rebecca finally spoke up, her voice calm but cutting. "Say what you mean, Ethan." Silence. Ethan exhaled, deflecting. "All I'm saying is that corporate leaders—" Daniel didn't let him run from it. "You mean successful people. People who build things. People who risk everything and don't quit when it gets hard." The crowd erupted again. Applause, agreement, nods. The room was turning against Ethan fast. Rebecca turned slightly in her chair, looking straight at him. "Ethan, let me ask you something. You've built a career out of attacking people like me. Have you ever considered, just for a second, that maybe your anger is misplaced? That instead of blaming people who succeed, we should be asking why more people don't?" Ethan had no answer, because there wasn't one. The moderator glanced at his notes, trying to get the panel back on track. I think we should move to our final questions." But it was too late. The moment had already been seared into everyone's minds, and the cameras had caught every second of it. By the next morning, clips from the debate were everywhere. 18-year-old destroys journalist in viral debate. CEO's son shuts down reporter, must watch. Daniel Lawson just ended an entire argument with one sentence. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, millions of views in hours. People weren't just watching, they were talking. Some called Daniel the voice of reason. Others said he was just privileged and clueless. But one thing was clear. He had struck a nerve. Rebecca sat in her office the next morning, scrolling through the headlines, the clips, the debates. Some people agreed with them. Others attacked them. But Daniel, he just shrugged. People will think what they want. Rebecca looked at her son, really looked at him. The little boy she used to carry in her arms, the kid who used to ask her a million questions about the world, was now a young man standing on his own. She reached over, squeezed his shoulder. "I'm proud of you." Daniel just smirked. "You should be. I learned from the best." The dust settled, but the conversation didn't fade. For weeks, Daniel's words echoed across the internet. Debates raged on TV and articles on social media. Some people praised him for speaking the truth. Others dismissed him as another kid defending privilege. But no one could ignore what had happened. Rebecca sat across from Daniel at their kitchen table one evening, sipping coffee, phone buzzing with new notifications. "You realize you started something, right?" Daniel grinned, stretching back in his chair. "Guess I did." Rebecca shook her head, smiling to herself. "The funny thing is, I never wanted you to fight my battles." Daniel met her gaze, serious now. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because I'm tired of people acting like success is something to be ashamed of." She studied him for a moment, seeing something in him that hadn't been there before. Conviction, strength, clarity. "People love underdogs," Daniel continued. "They love the struggle story, until you win. Then suddenly, you're the villain." Rebecca exhaled, setting her coffee down. "That's the world. They'll love you one day and tear you down the next." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, but I'd rather be someone who builds than someone who just tears things down." A beat of silence. Then Rebecca chuckled. "You really are my son." They clinked their coffee mugs together, a silent agreement between two people who understood something the world often forgot. Success isn't something to apologize for. It's something to fight for. What do you think? Should success be celebrated or criticized? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And remember, it's not about where you start. It's about how hard you're willing to fight.